The dust drifted in the still air like suspended memory, hanging above the forgotten room as if waiting for someone to finally disturb its long pause. The air felt colder than the outside corridor, as though the walls had kept a fragment of time sealed inside them. The investigator paused at the threshold, letting the faint echo of old silence settle around him. The place had been untouched for years, yet it carried a presence that felt closer than any living witness. Light from a single overhead bulb flickered gently across the tiled floor, and the faint reflection revealed why he had returned. Something unfinished waited in the quiet. He stepped inside, careful and methodical, boots whispering against the surface. The abandoned room in the county facility had once been part of a small administrative wing, later shut down when budgets tightened. Files had been relocated, boxes stacked, lights switched off, and yet this chamber had never been fully cleared. It was here in late 2003 that a scene had been processed, an event recorded, documented, stored, and then slowly buried under time. Not lost, but rarely spoken of. He let the door fall shut behind him. The old chalk outline remained faint on the tiles, worn down by years of climate shifts and the slow erosion of memory. It was barely visible now, a suggestion more than a shape. The investigator reached out, touching the cool surface of a metal cabinet beside him, grounding himself. The smell of dust was thick, mixing with the faint trace of old paper and cleaning solvent. Everything was quiet enough that the soft creak of his leather notebook as it opened felt amplified. Her name returned to him before he could stop it. Elara Venn. Age 27. A studio painter who had worked part-time at a small community art center near Tucson, known by colleagues to be quiet, somewhat private, with a habit of sketching during her breaks. She had been found here, this very room, after hours when the wing was still occasionally used for storage. The details had never fully settled in his mind, never formed a complete shape. Something in the original files had never aligned. He closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling the slightly metallic air. The old case had followed him for years, threaded through his memory like a faint light seen through fog. The conclusion back then had been procedural, clean, straightforward. Yet each time he thought about the way the evidence had been laid out, her bag, her sketchbook, that single photograph tucked inside it, something felt displaced, as though it belonged to a slightly different puzzle. Returning here now, 2 decades later, was unavoidable. A recent archival review had uncovered a discrepancy. One item logged twice, one item never logged at all. A small error, on paper insignificant, but small errors sometimes pointed toward something larger, something that had been waiting. He lowered himself into a crouch and examined the tile floor. The faint white trace of chalk blended into the surface like a fading memory, barely marking where Elara had once been found. In the silence, he imagined the original team stepping around the space, positioning measuring tapes, photographing angles, quietly doing their work without knowing the weight their decisions would someday carry. A soft rustle echoed behind him. He turned, only loose papers settling in the draft from the vent. The building's old ventilation hummed like distant static. He rose and crossed to the row of metal shelves against the wall. These shelves had been used for temporary storage back then. Most of the objects now were generic, outdated forms, old binders, a few collapsed cardboard boxes whose labels had long since peeled away. But his attention focused on a single brown box near the far end, labeled only with a faded code he recognized. He lifted it carefully. Inside were several items wrapped in archival tissue, objects that had once been part of the initial review. He unwrapped the first, a stack of processed photographs from the old scene. The edges were slightly curled from years of storage. He flipped through them slowly, the images capturing the room much as it still stood, same angle of the cabinets, Same crack on the far wall, same light fixture drooping slightly where the screws had loosened. One photograph stopped him. It was a close-up of Elara's sketchbook lying open. He remembered studying this very picture years ago, but seeing it again stirred, quietly, subtly, something that had bothered him even then. On the page was a charcoal drawing, unfinished, a set of vertical lines that might have been trees or pillars. The strokes were sharp, abrupt, unlike the gentle style she was known for. A fragment of fingerprint dust was visible along the margin in the photo's corner, a mark the technician had left behind. He set the stack down and removed the next wrapped object, a small file folder containing handwritten notes from the initial statements. He opened it, letting the pages breathe after years of confinement. The soft rustle echoed as though the room exhaled with him. A colleague's statement sat on top, short, hesitant, written with careful pen strokes. She stayed longer that day, said she had something to finish. Didn't say what, she looked focused, not worried, just focused. The handwriting paused mid-sentence, as though the writer had searched for the right word and then abandoned the attempt. He read the rest quietly. Nothing in these notes pointed toward anything unusual, but something inside him still resisted the tidy narrative the case had once been filed under. He tucked the notes away and reached for the final item inside the box, a sealed envelope that had been marked for internal review but never processed beyond its initial intake. He frowned slightly. He didn't remember this envelope. That alone was unusual. He turned it over, checking for signatures or dates. Only a single line was written across the front, faint pencil, barely legible. Found near north shelf. He carefully opened it. Inside was a single photograph. He held it up to the flickering overhead bulb. It was of Elara, standing outside the art center, smiling slightly, holding a folded canvas under one arm. It looked candid, taken from a modest distance. She wasn't looking directly at the camera, but slightly past it, as though she had just turned her head in mild acknowledgement of someone calling her name. He studied the edges. The print was older than the others, slightly more faded, processed on a different kind of paper. It wasn't one of the official scene photos, nor one taken by her colleagues. It didn't match any item logged in the initial review. Someone had taken this picture. Someone who had been close enough to follow her, or at least observe her from across the street. Someone whose presence had not been documented. He lowered the photograph slowly, letting the implication settle into the silence. His breath steadied, the air heavier now. The small discrepancy in the archival review had led him to this. A photograph out of place was never just a photograph out of place. It meant something had been missing from the picture they believed they had solved. Something overlooked. He turned the photo over. On the back was a short mark, a very small line of blue ink, almost invisible, like the start of a note that had never been written. Not a full sentence, barely even a character. A hesitation mark. He slid the photo between his fingers, studying the texture. The edges showed slight wear, but only on one side, as if someone had carried it loosely in a jacket pocket, pulling it out occasionally to look at it. The idea created a subtle weight in his chest, a quiet pressure. He placed the photograph on the metal table in the center of the room. The bulb above buzzed softly, then steadied. He moved to the cabinet on the right side of the room. This cabinet had once contained the original evidence bags. Most had been transferred out, but he checked anyway. The drawers slid open with a low metallic groan. Inside the third drawer, he found something unexpected. A second envelope. This one was labeled with the old case number in familiar handwriting, his own. He froze, staring at the date. It was from the week after the initial review. yet he had no memory of writing this. He opened it. Inside was a note on plain paper, typed anonymous, 4 short lines. You saw something. It wasn't in the file. Check the photo again. North side. He read it twice, feeling a quiet shift inside him, like a distant fault line moving. He didn't recognize the formatting, the spacing, or the tone. It didn't match any internal communication style, and he had no recollection of receiving or documenting such a message. The contradiction unsettled him, not emotionally, but analytically, like an equation with one number that refuses to align. He placed the note beside the photograph on the desk. The silence in the room stretched out, thickening. He approached the north shelves again. Most items were irrelevant: old ledgers, stacks of brittle manila folders, a roll of yellowed tape. But something on the lower shelf caught his eye: a thin strip of adhesive residue, slightly darker than the surrounding surface, as though a label or photograph had once been attached there, later removed. He crouched, examining it closely. The residue formed a rectangular outline. The size matched the photograph lying on the table. He inhaled slowly. The significance was small, quiet, yet undeniable. Someone had placed the photograph here once. Someone had removed it without logging the removal. Someone who had been inside the room after the official review. He rose with measured calm and returned to the table. His fingers brushed the photograph lightly, feeling its cool surface. If the picture had once been on that shelf facing outward, then it had been meant for someone to find, or someone to notice. Not prominently displayed, but not deeply hidden either. Positioned so that only a careful, thorough search would reveal it. A message for someone who paid attention. He thought about Elara again, her quiet presence, her gentle sketches, her unfinished drawing found beside her. He wondered what she had been working on that day, what had kept her late, what she might have intended to complete. He wondered who had taken this photograph. The room felt different now. He sensed the faint tremor of possibility shifting through the dust-filled air. Something small had been waiting here all these years, suspended like the dust motes drifting through the lone beam of flickering light. He stood still, letting the weight of the discovery settle. When he finally exhaled, it came out slow. The case was no longer what it had been. And the first deviation was right here on the table, staring back at him. He stood over the table a long moment, letting his eyes adjust to the simple, silent truth laid out in front of him. A photo that should not exist. A note he did not remember receiving. Residue on a shelf that suggested deliberate placement. None of it loud, none of it dramatic, just small fractures in a structure that had once felt stable. He knew better than to search for leaps. Real breakthroughs grew from quiet, logical shifts, the kind that could be traced step by step. He lifted the photo again, holding it by the edges. Elara's calm expression in the picture contrasted sharply with the tension he now felt threading through the room. She looked unaware of whoever had taken the shot. Not anxious, simply present, confident enough to walk home alone, unaware of the shadow that might have been just beyond the corner. He checked the back of the photo once more. The faint blue mark still seemed meaningless, but he studied the ink more closely, its positioning, its tilt. It didn't align naturally with the picture's edge. He placed it on the table under the harsh overhead bulb and leaned down. The mark had a subtle curve at its end, as though part of a letter rather than a random pen stroke. He reached into his notebook for a magnifier. Under closer inspection, the single mark revealed itself to be the top half of a character, possibly the start of a name initial. But only barely. Everything else was erased or never completed. He exhaled through his nose, a soft, controlled breath. Whoever had written on the back had started to leave something behind, hesitated, and then either stopped intentionally or been interrupted. He placed the magnifier aside. The next step wasn't dramatic, cross-referencing archives, retracing logs, reconstructing moments. He left the room slowly, closing the door behind him, and made his way down the muted corridor toward the archival office at the far end. The building had the quiet feel of a place that held more past than present, slow humming fixtures, distant echo of footfalls, the soft rattle of an old air duct shifting as temperature changed. Inside the archival office, he accessed the old digital log. The interface was outdated but functional. The case file number appeared like it had so many times before, stable, ordinary, silent. He scanned the chain of custody entries from that week in 2003. The movement of evidence had been straightforward. Intake, catalog, transfer, storage. Nothing irregular. Nothing to suggest someone had entered the room unofficially. Yet the photograph existed. It had been placed on the shelf. And the note, typed, unsigned, had been sealed in an envelope with his handwriting on the exterior. He leaned back slightly in the chair, feeling the small throb of tension along his temples. His handwriting was precise, consistent. The label on the envelope had matched that style, which meant either he had written it and forgotten, unlikely, or someone had imitated it with a practiced eye. The idea wasn't alarming, just telling. Whoever had done so knew enough about internal procedures to make the envelope blend in. He returned to the chain of custody log and pulled up the personnel list from that month. A handful of investigators, 2 administrative clerks, 1 custodian assigned to the wing. None of the names stood out, but he looked at them more slowly, letting each one settle. Names have weight, even when years old. Sometimes the weight shifts when held up to new evidence. One entry in particular caught his attention. A transfer logged late at night, time-stamped after his shift should have ended. The digital signature was his. But he had no memory of being on site that night. He downloaded the log and compared the signature patterns from that period. The characters matched his usual style, same pressure distribution, same slight curvature at the end. Yet when he stared at the image on the screen, something inside him resisted. A small, precise intuition, the kind that had grown sharper over decades in the field. He checked the timestamp metadata. The signature image file had been uploaded 2 minutes after the log entry. Normally, both happened simultaneously. If someone had manually uploaded an image after the fact, the system would still accept it but record the gaps subtly within the metadata. Most wouldn't notice the distinction, but the system's internal clock preserved it. He inhaled slowly. It was a small detail, a quiet one, but it echoed the same pattern as the photograph residue and the half-written mark on the back of the print. Someone had been precise in their adjustments, but not perfect. He printed the log, slid it into a folder, and returned to the abandoned room. Inside, the light flickered again in its slow, almost rhythmic pattern. He walked to the north shelf and stood in front of it. The thin residue mark, still visible in the stark light, seemed to look back at him, a remnant of intention. He removed his gloves and touched the metal surface lightly. Cold, smooth, untouched for years. When he stepped back, he noticed something he hadn't before, a faint scratch on the lip of the shelf. Thin, shallow, horizontal, not from storage or general use. Those caused wear, dense discoloration. This was deliberate. He knelt again. The scratch had 2 fine intersections on one end, forming a tiny angle. A symbol, a guide, or simply the accidental result of something being placed there with precision. He reached into the lower shelf and began examining the older files stacked there. Most were irrelevant, maintenance logs, outdated memos, year-old forms. But near the back, pressed flat against the wall, was a binder with a cracked spine. He pulled it out gently. Something shifted inside it with a soft, dull click. He opened it carefully. Inside, between two empty plastic sleeves, lay another photograph. This one was smaller, older, printed on matte fiber paper. It showed a section of the same administrative wing, but years earlier before renovations. The walls were a different color. The cabinets were arranged differently. And in the far corner, near where the chalk outline now faded, something caught his eye. A small patch on the wall, shaped like a narrow rectangle, as though something had once been mounted there. He studied the old photo. The angle was deliberate. Someone had taken it to document that specific corner. Not as part of the crime scene, this was from years before, long before Elara's case. He flipped the photo over. Nothing on the back, no markings, no notes. But the fact it existed, and had been tucked away inside an unrelated binder, meant someone had preserved it intentionally. He compared the new photo with the layout of the room. The patch on the wall in the old image corresponded exactly to where the north shelf now stood, which meant the shelf had been installed years after whatever had once occupied that wall. He returned to the wall and ran his hand along it slowly. The paint here had a slightly different texture, smoother, a concealed repair. He stepped back again, adjusting his perspective. Something had once hung here. Something rectangular, mounted at eye level, removed before the incident, removed before the renovation, removed before the shelf had covered the mark. He placed both photographs on the table, the one of Elara outside the art center, and the older one showing the earlier state of the wing. He let the two images sit side by side. The air felt still around them, as though the room held its breath. A quiet thought formed. If someone had taken Elara's photograph and placed it precisely on the shelf, they may have been referencing the earlier image, placing the new photo where the old object once hung. A symbolic connection, or a guide pointing toward something forgotten. He opened his notebook and began writing, not to solve, but to trace. The connections were emerging not as leaps but as threads. Elara's photo. The old image of the room. The typed note. The forged digital signature. The residue and scratch on the shelf. Nothing contradicted the next logical step. Someone had been operating around the case with knowledge of both what existed in the past and what had been erased. Someone who had moved through the space before anyone else knew to look. He checked the old personnel logs again, the physical ones stored in the cabinet under the table. He flipped through them quietly, page by page. The handwriting, the typeface, the stamps, he took in every detail. One name. He stopped. Not because the name was suspicious, but because it had appeared in 3 different places with 3 subtle differences. The middle initial varied. Once present, once missing, once replaced by another letter entirely. It was small, almost ignorable, but no one signs their name inconsistently on official documents from the same week. He read the name again. A clerk. Temporary assignment. No longer with the department. Last known address from nearly 2 decades earlier. He whispered the name once under his breath, almost experimentally. It didn't echo. The room absorbed it. He looked again at the blue hesitation mark on the back of Elara's photo. The curve at the end of the stroke resembled the curve of the clerk's first initial. Not matching fully, but suggesting pointing. His fingers drummed lightly on the table, slow, thoughtful. Not impatience, but recognition. He had returned to the scene expecting to find a procedural error. Instead, he had found a pattern. The clerk's involvement wasn't confirmed, but the inconsistencies aligned quietly with everything he had discovered. He stood again, walked to the far wall, and examined the sealed edge near the corner. The paint here was slightly uneven, as though a narrow seam had been repaired long ago. He pressed gently. The surface gave a faint, almost imperceptible creak. A hidden cavity. He retrieved a small tool from his pocket and carefully pressed along the seam. After a moment, a thin section of the wall shifted inward with a soft click. Dust fell in a slow cascade, stirred for the first time in years. Inside the narrow cavity was a folded sheet of paper. Nothing else. He removed it with 2 fingers and unfolded it on the table. The paper was thin, slightly brittle with age, typed, carefully aligned. 4 lines again. But not the same 4 from the envelope. You looked in the wrong place. The scene was changed. Check what was here before, not what came after. He read it twice, then a third time. This message couldn't have been written after the case had been filed. It referenced conditions before the renovation, meaning someone had left it at the time the wall cavity was still accessible, which meant the message had been waiting here since before the main incident. Something had been unfolding even before Elara's final day. He placed the second note beside the first. Side by side, the spacing of letters, the rhythm, the margin, they matched. Same writer. But the time gap between them was impossible to ignore. Someone had been communicating through the architecture of the room itself, leaving pieces behind long before anyone even knew they would matter. He sat down at the table again, inhaling the steady scent of dust and old paint. The timeline had shifted. Elara's case was not the beginning. It was the middle. Something else had started before her. Something hidden behind renovations, behind shelves placed over old mounting points, behind incomplete digital logs. He leaned back slightly, letting his thoughts settle into place, one by one. The small, devastating twist emerging from the logic was becoming clearer. He had never been investigating one event. He had been walking through the residue of 2. He remained seated for a long moment, letting the idea settle. 2 timelines, one layered quietly over the other. The first hidden behind renovations, paperwork, changes in layout. The second remembered through photographs, residue, notes that seemed to speak across years. He laid both typed messages side by side once more, studying their symmetry. Same formatting, same spacing, same silent urgency. The walls felt closer now, not in a confining way, but in a way that suggested the room held more memory than square footage. He turned slowly, taking in each corner, each faint crack, each strand of dust suspended in the loose beam of the overhead bulb. Whatever had begun here had not been meant to be found in full. Only small fragments had been left behind, as if the message itself had been designed to be incomplete. He gathered the items on the table, Elara's photograph, the older room photograph, the forged signature log, the 2 notes, and the printed personnel discrepancies. Each piece carried a kind of restraint, a quiet intent that hinted at someone who never wanted to be fully seen. Someone who left enough for interpretation but not enough for resolution. He took the personnel file again and read the clerk's name softly, almost without sound. The letters formed a shape in his mind, punctuated, unremarkable, easily forgotten. A temporary position, a short employment span, filed and archived decades ago. But names, like evidence, sometimes returned when everything else had been stripped away. He stood again and walked to the northeast corner of the room. The faint seam he had discovered earlier was not the only irregularity. Now that he knew how to look, he saw another thin vertical groove near the baseboard. He crouched, inspected the alignment, and followed the subtle indentation upward with his fingertips. Another cavity, perhaps, or simply old structural repair. He tested the pressure gently, methodically. A soft shift responded. A sliver of dust fell from the seam. He leaned closer and applied slow, steady pressure along the top edge. The panel gave way silently. Behind it lay only a pocket of shadow. No objects, no paper, no remnants. But the hollow itself mattered. Someone had once known these walls well enough to hide what they wished and remove what they didn't want left behind. He closed the panel and stood straight. It wasn't disappointment he felt, just recognition. Rooms often held more gaps than answers. Investigations didn't require grand revelations. They required steady, patient understanding. Something had played out here long before Elara ever entered the building. And that earlier story had shaped the room she would later step into, unknowingly crossing into someone else's unfinished sequence. He returned to the table and studied the old photograph again. The earlier layout captured the corner cabinet from 2 decades prior. A small label sat at the bottom edge of the shelf in that image, too blurred to read. He pulled the magnifier again and tilted the photo under the light. Even enlarged, the letters were impossible to decipher, but the shape of the label was distinctive, a long strip, narrow, with 2 small guide marks at the ends, a style used in internal offices during the late 90s. He checked the current shelves. None had that kind of label, meaning the shelf shown in the old image had been removed entirely before Elara's case. Which meant someone had photographed it specifically because they knew it would soon be gone. He exhaled. The past and present shelves mirrored each other in position, but not origin. That deliberate parallel felt intentional, as though someone had constructed a quiet echo in the layout. He felt the faint hum in the building again, a fan in the distance, or a hallway vent shifting. The sound grounded him. He slid the documents together and placed them in a simple, neat stack. He turned off the flickering bulb for a moment, letting the darkness settle. The silence became deeper, more dimensional. He breathed in the scent of old paint, dust, air that carried faint traces of things unsolved. Then he flipped the switch again. The light returned with its familiar, uneven pulse. He leaned against the table's edge and allowed the investigation to reorganize itself. The photograph of Elara had been placed after the renovation. The earlier photograph had been hidden years before that. The notes had been left at different times but by the same hand. The forged signature had been crafted to mimic him, but the metadata revealed the gap. All of it pointed back quietly, consistently, to one person with access, knowledge, and a habit of leaving traces only partially exposed. The clerk, a temporary employee whose work logs ended abruptly. No disciplinary marks, no formal transfers, simply gone from the records after a few months. He found the file again and ran his finger along the edge of the page. There was no forwarding contact, only a final address, an apartment on the east side of Tucson that had since been converted to a different property. Nothing left there now. But the name had appeared 3 different ways. That discrepancy had been the first reliable thread. He studied the variations. One entry used a middle initial, another omitted it, a third replaced it. Inconsistencies usually came from the writer, not the subject, meaning the clerk's identity might not have been stable even then. An alias, a fragmented record, or someone moving through positions quietly, shifting identifiers as they went. He made a note: check employment variations, cross-reference external archives. The next step would take him out of the room, but he remained a little longer. The dim space had become an archive of the unsaid. He reached for Elara's photograph and held it gently. The faint blue mark on the back still felt incomplete. He angled it under the light. The curve at the end of the mark mirrored the curvature of the forged middle initial on one of the entries. Subtle, but present. Not proof, but pattern. His thoughts shifted to Elara herself. Her sketches, her quiet presence, her unfinished charcoal drawing of vertical lines. It could have been anything: trees, pillars, edges of a structure. Or perhaps she had been sketching something she'd seen in this very wing before. Art often captured impressions unconsciously. He imagined her stepping into the room that day. Perhaps she noticed something on the shelf. Perhaps she reached for it. Or perhaps she simply paused near the north wall, catching a glimpse of residue, a faint mark, something that stirred her curiosity. People often sense the presence of history even without understanding it. He placed the photo back on the table. Then he noticed something. The edge of Elara's photograph cast a very slight shadow across the table under the flickering light. But the shadow revealed something he hadn't seen before: a tiny indentation along one side of the print, near the corner, barely visible unless struck by light at a shallow angle. He lifted the photo again and felt the corner with his fingertip. A small impression, almost like the dent left by a thin clip or metallic edge pressing lightly against it. He checked the residue outline on the shelf. The dimensions aligned almost perfectly, meaning the photograph had been clipped or fastened when it had been placed there, not simply set down. He examined the shelf lip again. Near the faint scratch was a minuscule puncture, round, as though a pin or clip had once been anchored there. That detail mattered. He took the old 1990s photograph and aligned it with the current shelf position. The earlier shelf structure in the old image had a built-in metal clip attached to its underside. The new shelf had been installed without one, which meant whoever placed Elara's photograph had either improvised a clip or reused an old one. He leaned closer. On the underside of the current shelf lip, nearly invisible beneath dust, was a tiny metallic remnant, half of a broken clip, rusted, lodged into the wood. He touched it carefully. The clip matched the style from the older photo, meaning the new shelf had inherited an old component, transplanted quietly, not by accident. Someone had preserved that one detail on purpose. He stepped back. A quiet realization unfolded. The person who left the clues had not been leaving a random trail. They had been guiding attention across time, connecting the earlier shelf, its mounted object, its placement, to the new shelf in Elara's photograph. It wasn't symbolic. It was instructional. A sequence. Something had once been on the old shelf, removed before the renovation. Then, years later, replaced with a photograph of someone who had unknowingly crossed into the same pattern. He opened his notebook and wrote a single line. Someone wanted continuity. He sat with the thought. Continuity suggested a reason, not dramatic but methodical, something carried through years, something the clerk had known, preserved, adjusted. He spread out both photographs again. The earlier one, the later one. He aligned them by the shelf placement, the wall alignment, the angle of the corner. When positioned carefully, nearly edge to edge, a subtle pattern emerged, a consistent vertical alignment between a corner shadow in the old photograph and the line of cabinets in the new one. The same angle, the same vantage point, not coincidence. Both images were taken from the exact same spot. He stood there, slowly taking in the alignment. Someone had documented the room twice, from the same angle, years apart. Once before Elara, once after. He walked to the far corner where the camera position would have been. The location was beside the file cabinet against the wall. He stood in the exact place. The angle matched perfectly. The sightline pointed directly to the north wall. He turned his head slightly. A small mark on the paint, almost microscopic, sat exactly where a camera tripod edge might have touched the wall. He brushed his thumb over it, smooth indentation, faint, old. He stepped back, absorbing the weight of that moment. Someone before and after had recorded the room from the same vantage point, documenting changes, preserving continuity, leaving partial clues. Someone who understood the architecture better than the staff. Someone who had worked quietly, intermittently, leaving imprints. He returned to the table and picked up the clerk's file again. The employment dates, the address, the inconsistencies, the sudden end. He drew a slow breath. The small, devastating twist emerging from the logic crystallized simply. The clerk had not vanished. The clerk had never fully arrived. The identity had been a shell, an access path used briefly, quietly, and then discarded. The person behind it had monitored the space long before Elara, and long after. Their presence in the records had been a temporary surface. Their trail had been built into the architecture, into the layout shifts, into the small details others overlooked. He looked again at Elara's photograph. Someone had observed her as they once observed the room, quietly, from a distance, without intrusion, but with intent. The photograph wasn't a threat. It was an inclusion, an addition to the sequence. She had become part of a continuity she never knew existed. He gathered everything and placed it neatly in the folder. He stood at the center of the room and exhaled slowly, letting the dust settle in the beam of failing light. Justice, when it came, would be procedural, tracked through logs, identification requests, archived employment forms, cross-referenced databases. Mechanical steps, nothing cinematic, nothing dramatic. But the human residue was quieter. A room that had held two timelines. A clerk with three variations of a name. A photograph taken from the same angle across decades. A person whose presence existed only in the subtle architecture of attention. Elara's case would find resolution through paperwork and persistence. The earlier story, the one that shaped the room itself, might never be fully recovered. The walls kept pieces. The shelves kept outlines. The light kept shadows of things once mounted. He closed the folder gently. The room felt unchanged, yet no longer silent. He stepped out into the hallway, leaving the door slightly ajar, not out of oversight but acknowledgement. Some things would remain unresolved. Not forgotten. Just beyond the reach of full understanding. He walked down the quiet corridor, the dust settling behind him like the last fragments of a story that had waited too long to be seen.